The sky over the high pasture still hung blue and indifferent when Brandt Zimmerman noticed his cattle had stopped eating. Every head turned east with ears swiveled forward, like they were listening to something he could not hear. And he knew with the certainty of 20 years on this land that he should have started driving them down an hour ago. "Your herd is telling you the truth," a voice said behind him, and he turned in the saddle to find the orc woman sitting her horse at the pasture gate, one hand resting easy on her thigh. Priska Calloway had been in the valley 6 weeks, a healer who had bought the old Henderson cabin and spent her mornings gathering plants and her afternoons setting bones for anyone who would let her touch them, which was not many. She wore practical canvas trousers and a shirt the color of creek stone, her green skin showing at throat and wrists, her small tusks visible when she spoke. "There is a storm coming from the east. They can smell the rain on the wind." "Appreciated," Brandt said, keeping his tone neutral, because he had not asked for her opinion and did not particularly want company on the drive down. But she nudged her horse forward anyway and began circling the herd with the ease of someone who knew what she was doing. "I thought you might need help moving them," she said when she came around to his side again. 300 head is a lot for one man when the weather turns. I have managed before. I am sure you have." She did not smile, but there was something in her eyes that might have been amusement. "But you are going to manage faster with 2, and I have nothing pressing until tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the eastern horizon where the first thin line of cloud was beginning to show, then back at his cattle who had now begun to drift nervously toward the downhill side of the pasture without any prompting. "Stay on the left flank," he said. "Keep them bunched, but do not push too hard. The trail gets narrow through the rocks." She nodded and moved into position, and together they started the herd down the mountain. It went smoothly for the first hour. The cattle knew the trail and moved at a steady pace, and Priska proved herself competent, anticipating the places where a calf might break or a cow might balk and positioning herself to prevent it before it happened. Brandt found himself relaxing slightly, enough to notice the way she sat her horse, balanced and quiet, and the way she spoke to the cattle when they crowded too close, low-voiced and calm. "You have done this before," he said when they stopped to let the herd drink at the creek crossing. "I grew up on a farm," she said. "We raised goats mostly, but the principles are the same. Keep them moving, keep them calm. Do not let them know you are worried even when you are. Are you worried?" She glanced at the sky, which had gone from blue to a sullen gray in the last 30 minutes, the clouds piling up like stones. "Yes," she said. "That storm is moving faster than I thought it would." He followed her gaze and felt his stomach tighten. She was right. The clouds were already overhead, and the wind had picked up enough to flatten the grass and make the horses sidestep. "We need to move," he said, and turned his horse back to the herd. They pushed harder after that, and the cattle sensed the urgency and began to trot, their hooves drumming on the packed earth of the trail. Brandt could feel the first drops of rain on his face, cold and widely spaced, and then the sky opened and the rain came down in sheets, turning the world gray and blurring everything more than 10 feet away. "We are not going to make it to the ranch," Priska shouted over the roar of the rain, pulling her horse up beside his. "There is a drover's shelter," he shouted back, pointing ahead and to the right. "Stone building 1/2 mile. We can push the cattle into the canyon beyond it and wait out the worst." She nodded, water already streaming down her face, and together they drove the herd off the trail and into the narrow canyon that opened up between 2 rock faces. The cattle went willingly, seeking shelter from the wind, and once they were bunched in the lee of the canyon wall, Brandt turned his horse toward the stone shelter that sat at the canyon mouth. It was a simple building, One room with a fireplace and a roof that had been repaired more times than he could count. Built by the drovers who had used this trail 50 years ago, and maintained by the ranchers who used it now. He swung down from his horse and pushed open the door, and Priska followed him inside, both of them dripping water onto the stone floor. "I will see to the horses," she said, and disappeared back into the rain before he could argue. He stood in the doorway and watched her lead both animals to the lean-to on the side of the building, unsaddle them with quick, efficient movements, and rub them down with a piece of sacking she found hanging on a nail. By the time she came back inside, she was soaked through, her hair plastered to her skull and her shirt clinging to her shoulders. "There is firewood," he said, pointing to the stack in the corner, and she nodded and began building a fire while he stripped off his own wet coat and hung it on one of the pegs by the door. The fire caught quickly, and the small room began to fill with warmth and the smell of wood smoke. Brandt found a dented pot and filled it with water from the rain barrel outside, set it on the hook over the fire to boil. There was a shelf with a few supplies, coffee and salt, and a tin of beans that had been there since last summer, and he pulled them down and set them on the table. "How long do you think the rain will last?" Priska asked. She was standing close to the fire, holding her hands out to the flames. "Hard to say. Could be an hour, could be all night." He looked out the window at the solid wall of rain. "The river will be up by now. We will not be able to cross until it goes down. So we are stuck here, for tonight at least." She turned to look at him, water still dripping from her hair onto her shoulders. "I apologize for the inconvenience. If I had not offered to help, you would be home by now. I would be wet and miserable on the trail with 300 head of frightened cattle," he said. "This is better." "Is it?" She smiled slightly, showing the edge of her tusks. "You do not seem like a man who enjoys unexpected company." "I do not mind it when the company makes itself useful." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. "You did good work on the drive. Thank you." She wrapped her hands around the cup, holding it close to her chest. "That is generous coming from you. What is that supposed to mean? You have a reputation for being a man of few words." "I have been here 6 weeks, and I think you have spoken to me 3 times before today, and 2 of those times were to tell me where I could not graze my horse." He felt his face heat slightly. "The north pasture is leased to another rancher. I was not being unfriendly, I was being accurate." "I know." She took a sip of her coffee, watching him over the rim of the cup. "I am not offended. I just think it is interesting that a storm and a shared disaster have loosened your tongue. Is that a healer's observation? It is a person's observation. You do not have to be a healer to notice when someone would rather work than talk." He grunted and turned his attention to the beans, dumping them into the pot of boiling water and stirring them with a wooden spoon. The truth was, she had him pegged, and he did not particularly like being seen that clearly by someone he barely knew. He had always been a man who preferred action to conversation, who measured his words carefully and spoke only when he had something worth saying. It had served him well enough on the ranch, where the work spoke for itself, and the cattle did not care if he was chatty. "You are doing it again," Priska said, and he looked up to find her watching him with that same faint amusement. "Doing what?" "Retreating into silence rather than continuing a conversation that makes you uncomfortable. I am making dinner. You are stirring beans. It does not require that much concentration." He set the spoon down and met her eyes. "What do you want me to say?" "Nothing in particular. I am just making an observation. You make a lot of those. It is part of the job. Healers have to notice things, small details that other people miss. The way someone holds their body when they are in pain, the way their breathing changes when they are afraid. The way a rancher stops talking when the conversation gets too personal. This is not personal. This is two people stuck in a shelter waiting out a storm, if you say so. She turned back to the fire, and he had the distinct impression that she was laughing at him, though her face showed nothing but polite interest. They ate the beans in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fire, and afterward Brandt went out to check on the cattle and came back drenched again, the rain still coming down in solid sheets. Night had fallen while they ate, and the shelter was dark except for the glow of the fire. "There is one blanket," Priska said, pointing to the folded wool on the shelf above the fireplace. "You should take it. I will be fine by the fire." "You are still wet," he said. "You will freeze." "So are you. I am used to it." She gave him a long look, then stood and pulled the blanket down from the shelf, shook it out and draped it over her shoulders. "We can share," she said. "There is room enough for both of us if we sit close to the fire." He hesitated, and she raised an eyebrow. "I am not going to bite you, Brandt. I am cold and tired, and I have no interest in spending the night shivering to preserve your sense of propriety." He could not argue with that, so he sat down beside her and let her pull half the blanket over his shoulders. It was not a large blanket, and sharing it meant sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body through the wet fabric of their clothes. "This is better," she said after a moment. "Body heat is more efficient when it is shared." "Is that a healer's observation too?" "No, that is just common sense." He smiled despite himself, and she glanced at him. "What? Nothing. You are just very practical." "I have to be. Idealism does not set bones or stop bleeding." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain hammer on the roof and the fire crackle in the hearth. Brandt could feel himself beginning to relax, the warmth of the fire and the blanket and the woman beside him seeping into his bones, loosening the knots of tension in his shoulders. "Can I ask you something?" Priska said, and he nodded. "Why did you let me help you today? You could have refused, or you could have sent me away once we got the cattle into the canyon. But you did not." He thought about it for a moment, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "You were right," he said finally. "I did need the help, and you knew what you were doing. It would have been foolish to turn you away just because I prefer to work alone." "That is a very reasonable answer. But I have the feeling there is more to it than that." He glanced at her, at the firelight reflecting in her dark eyes, at the way the blanket framed her face. "You have had a hard time in the valley," he said slowly. "People are not kind to you. They cross the street when they see you coming. They do not invite you to their tables. I thought maybe if they saw us working together, saw that you were competent and useful, it might change their minds." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was softer than he had heard it before. "That is kind of you. It is just practical. You are a good healer and the valley needs one. It makes no sense to run you off because of ignorance. Even so." She shifted slightly, and he felt the warmth of her shoulder press more firmly against his. "Thank you. You are welcome." They fell silent again, and Brandt felt the exhaustion of the day begin to catch up with him, his eyelids growing heavy, his body sinking deeper into the warmth of the blanket. Beside him, Priska's breathing had evened out, slow and steady, and he thought she might have fallen asleep until she spoke again. "Can I ask you something else?" "Yes." "Why do you ranch alone? Most men your age have a wife, children, someone to help with the work." "I had a wife," he said, and felt her tense slightly beside him. "She died 7 years ago, fever. I am sorry. It was a long time ago. That does not make it easier." He did not answer because there was nothing to say to that, and after a moment she let it drop. They sat together in the warmth of the fire and the blanket, the rain still falling outside, and eventually Brandt felt himself beginning to drift, his head nodding forward, his body leaning slightly into hers. "Sleep," Priska said quietly. "I will keep the fire going." He wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was too strong, and he let his eyes close and his body relax, trusting her to keep watch while he rested. When he woke, the fire had burned down to embers and pale gray light was filtering through the window. He was lying on his side with the blanket pulled up to his chin, and Priska was sitting beside the fire with a fresh piece of wood in her hands, feeding it carefully into the coals. "Morning," she said when she saw him stir. "The rain has not stopped yet, but it is lighter." He sat up, rubbing his face, and looked out the window. She was right. The rain was still falling, but it was a steady drizzle now instead of the torrential downpour of the night before. "I should check on the cattle," he said, and pushed himself to his feet. The herd was still bunched in the canyon, wet and miserable but intact, and he counted heads and found them all accounted for. When he came back inside, Priska had made more coffee and was frying bacon in a pan over the fire, the smell of it filling the small room. "Where did you find bacon?" he asked, and she pointed to his saddlebag hanging on the wall. "I hope you do not mind. I thought we could both use a proper breakfast." "I do not mind." They ate together, sitting on the bench by the window, and watched the rain continue to fall. It went on all through the morning and into the afternoon, lighter than the night before but steady, and Brandt knew without asking that the river would be too high to cross until the next day at least. "We are going to be here another night," he said, and Priska nodded. "I assumed as much." "Do you have enough supplies?" "For 2 people, yes. For 300 head of cattle it does not matter. They have grass and water, they will be fine." She smiled. "You care about them. They are my livelihood. It is more than that. I have seen the way you look at them, the way you talk to them. You care." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation but unable to deny it. "They are good animals. They deserve to be treated well. Most people would not see it that way. Most people are fools." She laughed at that, a real laugh that lit up her face and made her eyes crinkle at the corners, and he found himself smiling in response. The second day in the shelter passed more easily than the first. They talked more, trading stories about their lives, their work, the things they had seen and done. Brandt told her about the ranch, about the years he had spent building it up from nothing, about the challenges of running a herd this size on his own. Priska told him about her training as a healer, about The Chinese letter who had taught her, about the reasons she had left her family's farm and struck out on her own. "I wanted to help people," she said. "But my family did not understand why I would want to heal humans when they had done nothing but treat us like animals. They thought I was betraying my own kind." "Were you?" "No. I was trying to build bridges, to show that we are not so different, that we bleed the same and hurt the same and want the same things. But it is hard to build a bridge when the other side keeps burning it down. Some people are worth the effort," he said. "Some people will see you for who you are, not what you are. Are you one of those people?" He met her eyes across the fire. "I am trying to be." She held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them, something unspoken but understood, and then she looked away and the moment was gone. The third day dawned clear and cold, the storm finally blown out, and when Brandt went outside to check the river he found it still running high but passable if they were careful. He came back to find Priska already saddling the horses, her movements quick and efficient. "The river is down enough," he said. "We can cross this morning. Good. The cattle will be eager to get moving." They worked together to drive the herd out of the canyon and down to the river crossing, and Brandt was impressed again by how smoothly they functioned as a team, anticipating each other's movements, communicating with looks and gestures rather than words. The cattle crossed without incident, and by mid-morning they had them moving down the trail toward the valley. It was late afternoon when they reached the point where the trail split, one branch leading to Brandt's ranch and the other to the Henderson cabin where Priska lived. The cattle were tired and moving slowly, and Brandt knew it would be another hour before he had them settled in the home pasture. "Thank you for your help," he said, pulling his horse up beside hers. "I could not have done this without you." "You are welcome," she said. "It was good to feel useful." He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that he had enjoyed her company, that the 3 days in the shelter had been some of the easiest conversation he had had in years, but the words stuck in his throat and he could not get them out. She seemed to understand anyway, because she smiled and touched his arm briefly before turning her horse toward home. "If you ever need help again, you know where to find me." He watched her ride away, then turned his attention back to the herd and drove them home. The trouble started a week later. Brandt was out in the home pasture checking the herd when he noticed that some of the cattle were missing, not his full-grown stock but some of the spring calves, the ones that should have been there but were not. He counted again to be sure, riding the perimeter of the pasture and tallying each animal, and came up 30 head short. He rode over to his neighbor's place, a man named Gerald Horace who ran a smaller operation on the land to the south, and found exactly what he had feared. His calves were mixed in with Gerald's herd, and when he pointed them out, Gerald just shrugged. "Those are mine," Gerald said, "born on my land to my cows." "They were born on the trail during the spring drive," Brandt said, keeping his voice level. "When the storm hit and the herds got mixed up in the canyon, these calves got separated from their mothers, but they are mine and I can prove it. How? They are not branded yet. I know which cows they belong to. I kept records." "Records?" Gerald spat in the dirt. "That does not mean anything. The calves are on my land now, and that makes them mine. Unless you have got a brand on them, you have got no claim." Brandt felt his temper beginning to rise but kept it in check. "I am not looking for a fight, Gerald. I am just asking for what is mine. We can settle this with the brand inspector if we have to. Fine by me. I will send for him tomorrow." The brand inspector arrived 3 days later, a thin man named Morris with a ledger book and a permanent expression of impatience. He walked the herd with both Brandt and Gerald, listening to their competing claims, and in the end he sided with Gerald. "Without brands, there is no way to prove ownership," Morris said. "And Gerald has been in this valley longer than you have, Brandt. His word carries weight." "So you are just giving him my calves?" "I am making a judgment based on the evidence available. If you want to challenge it, you can take it to the county hearing, but I am telling you now that you are not going to win." Brandt knew he was beaten, at least for the moment, but the injustice of it burned in his chest. He rode home and spent the evening going through his records, looking for anything that might help his case. And that was when he remembered that Priska had been with him when the storm hit, had helped him drive the cattle into the canyon, had seen which calves belonged to which cows. He rode out to the Henderson cabin the next morning and found her in the garden, digging up roots for some medicine or another. She looked up when she heard his horse and smiled, wiping the dirt from her hands. "Brandt, this is a surprise. What can I do for you?" He explained the situation, the missing calves and Gerald's claim and the brand inspector's decision, and watched her face grow serious as he talked. "You want me to testify at the hearing," she said when he finished. "You saw which cows the calves were nursing from during the storm. You kept watch while I tallied them in the canyon. Your testimony could prove they are mine." "I did see that," she said slowly, "and I would be happy to testify. But Brandt, you need to understand something. My word does not carry the same weight as yours or Gerald's. I am an orc, and there are people in this valley who will dismiss anything I say just because of that. Then we make sure they cannot dismiss it. We present the facts clearly, we show the evidence, and we make them listen." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I will do it." "When is the hearing?" 2 weeks from tomorrow, County Courthouse. I will be there." He thanked her and rode home, feeling the first stirring of hope that he might actually get his calves back. The hearing was held on a cold morning in late autumn. The courthouse packed with ranchers and townspeople who had come to watch the proceedings. Brandt sat at the front with his records and his ledgers, and Gerald sat across from him with the brand inspector, and a smug expression that made Brandt want to hit him. The county magistrate, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had a reputation for fairness, called the hearing to order and asked both men to present their cases. Gerald went first, spinning a story about how the calves had been born on his land and had simply mixed in with Brandt's herd during the confusion of the storm, and how he was only claiming what was rightfully his. Then it was Brandt's turn. He presented his records, showed the dates and locations of the births, explained how the storm had scattered the herds and how he had worked to sort them out afterward. And then he called Priska to testify. She walked to the front of the room with her head high, dressed in clean, practical clothes, her green skin and small tusks drawing stares from everyone in the courtroom. The magistrate asked her to state her name and her business, and Priska answered clearly, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "My name is Priska Calloway. I am a healer and I live in the valley. And you were present during the storm that Mr. Zimmerman mentioned." "I was. I helped him move his herd to shelter when the storm hit, and I was with him in the canyon for 3 days while we waited for the rain to stop." "Did you observe the calves in question during that time?" "I did. I watched them nurse from their mothers, and I helped Mr. Zimmerman tally them when the storm passed. I can identify which calves belong to which cows based on what I saw." The magistrate nodded and made a note in her ledger. "Thank you, Miss Calloway. You have anything else to add?" "Only that I kept my own notes during those 3 days, and they match Mr. Zimmerman's records exactly. If it would help, I can provide them to the court." "That would be helpful, thank you." Priska pulled a small notebook from her pocket and handed it to the magistrate, who flipped through it and compared it to Brandt's ledgers. Then she looked up at Gerald. "Do you have any witnesses who can counter this testimony?" "She is an orc," Gerald said flatly. "Her word is not worth the same as a human's." The magistrate's expression went cold. In this courtroom, all testimony is weighed equally based on its merit, not on the species of the person giving it. "Do you have any actual evidence to counter what Miss Calloway has presented?" Gerald's face flushed. "No, but I have been in this valley for 30 years and I have never been accused of stealing before." "This is the first time you are being accused now. Mr. Zimmerman, do you have anything else to add?" Brandt stood, and every eye in the room turned to him. This was the moment where he should speak up and defend Priska, should make it clear that her testimony was valid and important. But the words stuck in his throat, the same way they always did, and he found himself frozen, unable to force them out. "No, Your Honor," he heard himself say and sat down. He felt Priska's eyes on him, felt the weight of her disappointment even though she said nothing, and he wanted to stand back up and explain, to tell the magistrate that Priska was the most competent and honest person he knew, but the moment had passed, and he had let it slip away. The magistrate reviewed the evidence for a few more minutes, then made her ruling. "Based on the records and testimony presented, I find in favor of Mr. Zimmerman. The calves in question are to be returned to his herd within 7 days. This hearing is adjourned." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Gerald stood up with a face like thunder, but the magistrate's ruling was final. Brandt should have felt relief, should have felt vindication, but all he felt was a sick weight in his stomach because he knew what he had done. He turned to thank Priska, but she was already walking toward the door, her shoulders straight and her head high. He followed her outside and caught up with her on the courthouse steps. "Priska, wait." She stopped but did not turn around. "Congratulations on your win. Thank you for testifying. You made the difference." "Did I?" Now she turned to face him, and her eyes were flat and cold. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were ashamed to be associated with me." "That is not true." "Then why did you not speak when the magistrate asked if you had anything to add? Why did you not defend me when Gerald said my word was worthless?" "I did not think I needed to. The magistrate already said that all testimony would be weighed equally." "The magistrate said it, but you did not, and there is a difference, Brandt. There is a difference between letting someone else fight your battles and standing up yourself." He opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand. "No, I do not want to hear it. I testified because you asked me to, and because it was the right thing to do. But I am not going to stand here and let you pretend that you stood beside me when you did not." She turned and walked away, and this time he did not follow. The next few weeks were miserable. Brandt got his calves back. Gerald delivered them with bad grace and a promise that this was not over, but the victory felt hollow. He kept thinking about the look on Priska's face on the courthouse steps, kept replaying the moment when he should have spoken and did not, and the knowledge of his own cowardice ate at him. He rode past the Henderson cabin twice, thinking he would stop and apologize, but each time he lost his nerve and kept going. What would he say? That he was sorry he had not defended her, that he wished he had spoken up. The words felt inadequate, and he was a man who dealt in actions, not apologies. It was the clerk from the Brandt inspector's office who finally pushed him over the edge. Brandt was in town buying supplies when he overheard the man talking to a group of other townspeople outside the general store. "Can you believe they let that orc woman testify at the hearing?" the clerk was saying. "Like her word means anything. Everyone knows you cannot trust them." "What did she testify about?" one of the others asked. "Some dispute over cattle. Zimmerman's calves got mixed up with Horace's herd, and the orc woman claimed she could identify which ones were which. The magistrate actually believed her." "Well, maybe she was telling the truth." "Maybe, but that is not the point. The point is that we are letting these creatures into our courtrooms, into our towns, treating them like they are the same as us. Next thing you know, they will be wanting to own land, to vote, to marry into our families." Brandt felt his hands clench into fists, felt the anger rising hot and fast in his chest. He stepped out of the general store and walked over to the group, and they fell silent when they saw him coming. "You have something to say about Priska Calloway?" he asked the clerk, and his voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. The clerk flushed. "I was just making conversation. You were spreading lies. Priska Calloway is a skilled healer and an honest woman, and her testimony at that hearing was accurate and fair. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me. I did not mean any offense." "Yes, you did. And if I hear you spreading rumors about her again, you and I are going to have a problem. Are we clear?" The clerk nodded quickly, and the group dispersed, leaving Brandt standing alone in the street. He took a deep breath, feeling some of the anger drain out of him, and then he climbed on his horse and rode straight to the Henderson cabin. Priska was inside, grinding herbs in a mortar, and she looked up in surprise when he knocked on the open door. "Brandt, what are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," he said. "I should have spoken up at the hearing. I should have defended you when Gerald questioned your testimony, and I should have made it clear to everyone in that room that I trust your word completely. I did not, and that was wrong, and I am sorry." She set down the mortar and studied him for a long moment. "What changed?" I heard the brand inspector's clerk spreading lies about you in town. I told him to stop, and I told him that if he had a problem with you, he could take it up with me. You did. I did. And I should have done it weeks ago, at the hearing when it would have mattered. I am not good with words, Priska. I never have been. But I am trying to be better, and I need you to know that I value you and I respect you, and I am sorry I did not show that when it counted. She was quiet for a long time, and he stood there in the doorway, waiting, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally she spoke. Thank you. That means a lot to me. Does it mean enough that you will forgive me? It means enough that I am willing to try. She smiled slightly, and he felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. But you have to understand, Brandt. I cannot be with someone who is ashamed of me. If we are going to be friends or anything more than that, you need to be willing to stand beside me in public, not just in private. I understand, and I will, I promise. All right then. She gestured to the chair by the fire. Sit down. I will make us some tea and you can tell me what else has been happening since the hearing. He sat, and they talked, and slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild the trust that had been damaged. The winter came hard and fast that year, with snow piling up in the passes and ice forming on the water troughs. Brandt spent his days breaking ice and feeding cattle, and his evenings he spent at the Henderson cabin, sitting by Priska's fire and talking about everything and nothing. They played cards and traded stories, and argued good-naturedly about the best way to treat frostbite and whether cows were smarter than horses. It was easy, being with her. Easier than it had been with anyone since his wife died. Priska did not demand constant conversation, or expect him to be someone he was not. She was content to sit in companionable silence when he was too tired to talk, and when he did talk, she listened with her full attention, asking questions that made him think and offering observations that made him laugh. Somewhere in the middle of that long, cold winter, he realized he was falling in love with her. It was not a sudden revelation, not a bolt of lightning or a moment of clarity. It was a gradual thing, built up over weeks and months of shared meals and shared work, of watching her move through the world with competence and grace, of seeing the way she cared for the people who came to her for healing even when they did not always treat her with kindness in return. He did not tell her, not right away. He was still learning how to speak the things that mattered, and this felt too important to rush. But he started doing things, small things that he hoped would show her how he felt. He repaired the leak in her roof without being asked. He brought her firewood and stacked it neatly by her door. He rode into town and bought her a set of proper medical instruments from the catalog, the kind with steel blades and fine points that she had been wanting but could not afford. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But she did not say anything, just smiled and thanked him and let the slow courtship continue. Spring came late that year, the snow lingering in the high country well into April, but when it finally arrived, it came with a rush of green and the sound of water running everywhere. Brandt started making plans for the spring roundup, the annual gathering of the herd to brand the new calves and check the health of the older stock. It was a big job, too big for one man, and this year he did not even consider trying to do it alone. He rode to the Henderson cabin and asked Priska if she would help him, and she agreed without hesitation. They worked together for a week, riding the high pastures and gathering the scattered cattle, driving them down to the home corrals where Brandt had set up the branding fire and the chutes. It was hard, exhausting work, but it went smoothly with two people, and by the end of the week they had every calf branded and every cow accounted for. On the last night of the roundup, they sat by the fire in the main corral, watching the embers glow and listening to the cattle settle down for the night. Brandt had something he wanted to say, something he had been thinking about for weeks, but the words were not coming easily. "Priska," he said finally, and she turned to look at him. "I have been thinking." "About what?" "About the ranch, about the future, about how much easier this week has been with you here to help." "It has been easier for me too. I enjoy the work." "I was wondering if you would consider making it permanent." She went very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean I want you to be my partner. In the ranch, in the work, in everything. I want your name on the deed and your brand registered beside mine. I want to build this place with you. Brandt." Her voice was soft, almost wondering. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I suppose I am. I know I am not good with words, and I know I have made mistakes in the past, but I care about you more than I have cared about anyone in a long time, and I cannot imagine doing this without you." She was quiet for a long moment, and he felt his heart hammering in his chest, waiting for her answer. Then she smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He let out a breath he had not known he was holding and reached for her hand, and she laced her fingers through his and held on tight. They were married a month later, in a simple ceremony at the ranch with the magistrate presiding and a handful of neighbors in attendance. Not everyone was happy about it. There were still people in the valley who disapproved of the match, but Brandt found that he did not care what they thought. He stood beside Priska in front of all of them and spoke his vows clearly, and when the magistrate pronounced them married, he kissed her in front of everyone and did not give a damn who was watching. The summer was good. They worked the ranch together, Priska proving herself as skilled with the cattle as she was with healing, and slowly the neighbors began to come around. They saw the way the ranch prospered with 2 people running it, saw the way Brandt and Priska worked together like they had been doing it for years, and most of them decided that maybe an orc wife was not the worst thing in the world. In the fall, they registered Priska's brand, a simple mark that looked like a flowering vine, and burned it into the herd beside Brandt's mark on every animal they owned. It was a public declaration, a statement that this was their herd and their ranch and their life together, and Brandt felt a fierce pride every time he saw the 2 brands side by side. The first real test came in the winter, when a sickness swept through the valley, and people started showing up at the ranch asking for Priska's help. She went to them without hesitation, riding out in the snow to treat fever and cough and all the other ailments that came with the cold season. And Brandt went with her, standing beside her in the sick rooms and helping her mix medicines and change bandages. He watched her save a child's life one night, working for hours to bring down a dangerous fever while the parents watched with terrified eyes. And when the child finally opened her eyes and asked for water, Brandt saw the relief and gratitude on the parents' faces and knew that Priska had finally earned her place in the valley. After that, things got easier. People started coming to the ranch for healing instead of avoiding it, started bringing gifts of food and supplies in thanks for Priska's help, started treating her like a valued member of the community instead of an outsider to be feared. Spring came again, and with it the roundup, and this time when Brandt and Priska rode out to gather the herd, they found that several of the other ranchers had left their gates open, a silent signal that they were welcome to drive their cattle across neighboring land without asking permission. It was a small thing, but it meant the world. They worked the roundup together, branding the new calves with their combined marks, and on the last day Brandt found Priska standing by the corral fence, looking out over the herd with a thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "I am thinking about how much has changed in the last year, how different my life is now from what I thought it would be." "Is that a good thing?" "It is the best thing." She turned to him and smiled. "I never thought I would have this." A home, a partner, a place where I belong. I spent so long trying to prove myself, trying to earn acceptance, and I was starting to think it would never happen. But then I met you and everything changed. You changed things, he said. You made me better. Made me see that words matter, that standing up matters, that there is more to being a good man than just doing the work and keeping quiet. We made each other better. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. They stood there together as the sun set over the mountains, watching their herd settle down for the night, and Brandt felt a contentment that he had not known he was capable of feeling. This was his life now, this ranch and this woman and this hard, beautiful work, and he would not trade it for anything. Later that evening, after they had finished the day's work and returned to the house, Brandt pulled out the tally book where they kept their records. It was a thick leather-bound volume, filled with notes and numbers and sketches of brand marks, and he flipped to the back page where he had written something earlier that day. "I have something for you," he said, handing the book to Priska. She took it and opened it to the marked page, and her eyes widened when she saw what was there. Pressed between the pages was a ring, simple silver with a small green stone set in the center, and beneath it he had written a few lines in his careful handwriting. "To Priska, my partner in all things. This ranch is ours, this herd is ours, this life is ours. Thank you for choosing to build it with me." She looked up at him with tears in her eyes, and he took the ring from the book and slipped it onto her finger. "I know I already gave you a ring at the wedding," he said. "But I wanted you to have something that was just from me, something that showed how much this last year has meant. You are my partner, Priska, in every sense of the word, and I wanted you to know that." "I do know that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But thank you. For this, and for everything." She kissed him then, and he held her close, the tally book still open on the table beside them, their combined brands sketched side by side on the page. The years that followed were not always easy. There were droughts and hard winters. There were neighbors who never quite accepted their marriage. There were challenges and setbacks and moments of doubt. But through it all, Brandt and Priska worked together, building their ranch and their life one day at a time. They never forgot that first storm, the 3 days they had spent in the drover's shelter sharing a blanket and learning to trust each other. It had been the beginning of everything, the moment when two strangers had become partners, and then friends, and then something more. And on cold, rainy nights, when the storms rolled in from the east and the cattle grew restless, they would sit together by the fire with a blanket over their shoulders and remember, and be grateful for the day the rain had brought them together.